So I'm going to be talking about WCM, Web Content Management to Web Content Services Migration. Before I start, my name is Richard McKnight. I work in the Alfresco consulting team. I've been involved with working with a lot of customers on various engagements, a wide variety of them. And we have a couple of customers that are starting now to look at having the old AVM-based content management, web content management, and looking, struggling with what should they do about it. I've been with Alfresco for about 3.5 years. And prior to that, I was involved with Alfresco from a client standpoint. So I've been around the product for a while. And I remember when the AVM first came out. So now seeing that it's, being set up for retirement is kind of an interesting thing. How many of you all have an AVM instance or AVM that you're running, right now? Okay. How many of you all are planning on staying with it, and how many of you really want to get off it? Well, how many of you want to stay with it as long as you can? Okay. Well, times are changing. The websites or the web properties that we have today are not the web properties that we had in 2005. They're built differently, content is authored differently, and the teams are different. I mean, the current product, the way the WCM and the AVM worked, was really, I think, targeted towards people who are developing websites. They had a lot of assets that related to each other. You were versioning the website, and when you made changes, you almost treated it like an application. You had all this stuff that was going together, and you had to snapshot it, make sure it was okay, and put it out there. Now a lot of our use cases, you have independent bits of content that are going to the web. They might be going to the web from a number of different sources. You might have some that are being authored, product information that might be going into a catalog somewhere, and as a byproduct of its process, it's going to the web. You may have other content that's being streamed out, pushed out by some automated process, and you may have also press releases or stuff going out, and this could be going out in the same website. And so the web of today and the websites that people go to are very different. Other things that have happened. So many of these use cases that I just talked about, the AVM really provides no added value. And we'll talk about some of the features in the AVM that probably are no longer providing value. The core repository has gotten the lion's share of the enhancements and the development. A couple of things as I go through this. When I say AVM or WCM, I'm talking about the old implementation. When I say Web Content Services or core repository, I'm talking about what we historically call DM, and talking about Web Content Services, how we're proposing to do things moving forward. Many of the compelling features that were keeping people from moving to Web Content Services and the core repository have been added to the core repository. So now there's a lot lower, there's less impedance for moving forward. And as of 4.0, the AVM is being deprecated. What that means is that if you're on 3.4, you can upgrade to 4.0. If you're not an AVM customer, you won't be able to become an AVM customer. So we're not taking any new AVM implementations. And the AVM will be around until 6.0 is released. Because once 6.0 is released, then 4.0 won't be supported. And as a result, we've kind of changed things from web content management to web content services. And that shift is a fundamental shift. So Alfresco is an enterprise content management system. To a large extent, web content is enterprise content. The stuff that we put out on the web is enterprise content. It should be managed as such. What the Web Content Services provides is a means for making content available on the web in a scalable fashion. So to a large extent, we have you have a authoring tier in which you manage the content, you create it, you check it out, you go through the workflows, and then, but that authoring tier is not really appropriate for putting, for backing a web application, because the authoring tier needs to have permissions, workflow, a lot of security. Once that content is ready to go to the web, you push it out to the web tier, and then it needs to be able to get to the customer in a lightning quick manner. So you don't have the security, because most of the stuff is publicly available, and you really just need it to be there so it can be pushed out to the web. So the question is, do I have to change? And well, you have some options. You can stay with the status quo, as we talked about before, and you can run on 3.x until Alfresco 5. You can upgrade to Enterprise 4, and then you'll be able to stay with the AVM until Alfresco 6, or you can upgrade to Alfresco 4 and switch to the core repository. The bottom line is you're going to have to change at some point, and the real question is, how do I change? What's the best way to change? What should I be thinking about as I make this change? One of the things that we need to think about when thinking about the change is, what is Web Content Services and what will it provide? So Web Content Services provides an open set of services that deliver content to the web. There's 3 components that make up Web Content Services, and you'll recognize them because they're also part of our historical web content management system. You have the core repository, which is the authoring tier. This is where you do all of the work of preparing the content. Then you have a CMIS compatible web tier repository. When we had the, in the WCM, this was called the ASR, and you have, so you have a place to push this content to, and it is a repository in the sense that it allows you to query the content, it allows you to have dynamic content and have smart queries about the content. So it's not just flat content out there that you pick up, but there's some smarts in the web tier repository. And then you have file system transfer receiver, which is similar to the FSR. This allows you to push static content out and make sure that this content can be delivered very quickly. And these 3 components are connected via the transfer services. So similar to the way that we had deployment in the old AVM system, we have transfer services that allow you to push content out to the web tier. Now, there are some differences between WCS, Web Content Services, and Web Content Management. In the AVM, we have 3 features that have no equivalent in the core repository. We have sandboxes, multi-asset versioning. What I mean by multi-asset versioning is, if you had a web page that you were updating and you had the HTML, you have some images, maybe a CSS file there, those assets might be changed together and you might have to carry them along as a set. And so that's something that's not, that only the AVM supported. And then we have snapshots and rollbacks. So that allows you to take a version of the website, and if you move forward, then you say, oops, I made a mistake, you can then roll back to the previous version. Now, the core repository has a number of features that are not available in the AVM. We have support for rules. So you can, as part of your managing content, rather than having each step act as a manual process, you may have, have a drop folder where people authoring content drop their content into a folder, and then the folder consumes it and says, oh, I need to do a number of things, and then push it into a workflow. You have more, have support for rules. You have more sophisticated access control. The WCM product had a set of roles that were rigid and applied to the use case that it was designed for. In reality, the roles that might be applied based on content that's going out to the web now, there may be a number of different roles. There may be the role of somebody who just creates the content. You may have another reviewer, and the workflows and the processes around getting content to the web now are much more complex. We have support for CMIS, and that allows you to build web tier applications that can interact with the web tier repository using CMIS, which is a standard. And that gives you a lot more flexibility and also lowers the bar of entry for a developer who might be developing a web tier application and needing to pull that content out. And in addition to those features, there's a number of other features or areas where the features are available in both the AVM and in the core repository, but they've just been improved in the core repository. The core repository has gotten all of the work and all of the love from the developers, so to speak. So what are the impact of these differences? Well, the Web Content Services web tier, so the web tier itself, not talking about the authoring tier, but the web tier itself has all of the functionality that's available in a WCM web tier. I mean, everything that you can do with the ASR and the FSR, you can do with the components that are provided for WCS. The additional and expanded features in the DM-based authoring tier should provide improvements for content authors. Now, the features that are available in the core repository, and you're free to ask questions and debate me on this, but they are useful for a small and shrinking set of use cases. And I think this harkens back to what I said at the beginning. This is not the web of 2005, okay? And so a lot of the features there, and I'll make a case for it, are really supporting a small set of shrinking use cases, and there are ways to get around it. So the characteristics of some of these sites in this shrinking group. You have sites that were versioned and released for deployment as a complete unit. And so this goes back to I'm building a website. I have a bunch of web pages. All of this content is interrelated. You look at anybody who built websites back before there was even Dreamweaver knew that you had to go to each file and have the same navigation. There was nothing that was generating the navigation. I mean, this really is rooted in back in the late 90s, early 2000s when it was a much more manual process. You might have sites where page changes include a large number of assets. And one of my contentions as to why this is even an older kind of a process is because if you look at a lot of the websites today, I mean, most of them are some kind of a content management system. So, if I build a Drupal site or a WordPress site, to a large extent, the CSS on the page, the navigation on the page, all of the information on that page that makes the page look the way it looks is really part of the theming of the page, and it has nothing to do with the content. And then you have, you might have some HTML and maybe a couple of images that are related to each other, but my contention is that that most of the content has a fairly loose coupling, between other content items, and so you can pretty much manage them as separate items. And then you have sites that were managed in Alfresco, where they were deploying code and content from the same instance. And I kind of use the term code loosely. So, you might think of code as like, oh, well, it's CGI code or JSPs or things like that. But it could also be the CSS, the CSS files that provide the look and feel, or maybe the images that provide the background and things like that. And part of my contention is for things like images, some are actually content, some are actually code or part of the theming, the core theming of the site. And so if you have sites that have these characteristics and you're trying to move away from WCM you're probably going to have to do some review of those sites in the process, and you probably need to do it early on because those sites are probably going to be the most challenging to migrate. Characteristics of some of the more emergent use cases. Content items have fewer interdependencies. Content on the same site may actually come from different sources. And you have content that might be targeted to multiple sites. Okay, I see a typo there. And content may appear on the web as a small part of a larger life cycle. Here's what I mean. You might, there's one client that we're working with now, and they manage case information, okay? Papers and exhibits and things like that. And most of their process is a document management process. You know, you have the judges looking at it, you have the plaintiffs and the defendants looking at it, but because of the nature of those cases, many of those documents have to be made available to the general public because, you know, by virtue of the Freedom of Information Act. So they have to be published to the web. Well, it's not really a WCM process, a classical WCM process. They're going to build some kind of a portal, and then they're just going to push this content to the web and let people actually search for it. So in that sense, each document that goes out really lives on its own. And they'll need a repository, you know, the runtime on the web because people are going to do searches for various things. So that'll create seamless query language searches and things like that. So that's why, so these are the kinds of cases, the kinds of use cases that I think we are really seeing moving towards the future. And these do not require the features in WCM that have been deprecated. So, is there life after the AVM? Okay. Yes, but. You know, so, and I'll just take a little bit of a segue. I truly think this is important. You've got to do this. I'm also not going to paint a rosy picture. It's not going to be easy. Okay? And I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. Projects with heavy dependencies on the AVM, so those projects that really need those features, you're probably going to have to do a fair amount of re-engineering, re-architecting, and possibly going back to the business sponsors and saying, we're going to have to change your process. You know, you might have to say, we're going to have to change the look and feel of the website. Maybe you can't support what they've been doing as a result. Now, the projects that naturally lend themselves to WCS, they're going to be more straightforward, but you will still have to do some renovation because some of the components, the components that are used to build these sites, some of the components that sit in there, some of the components that you're using are going to have fundamental differences to them. And so you'll have to take that into consideration. I truly believe there's benefits to moving in this direction. There are some aspects of the AVM that just are a challenge. I mean, if you look at the feature, for instance, the feature that allows you to take a snapshot, that feature also kills performance. That feature really, it doesn't allow you to have clustering, or even if you have clustering, the problem with that feature is when you take that snapshot, it then has to do a blocking operation so that none of the clusters can do anything while it actually goes and collects up all this information about the snapshot and then takes that snapshot. So there's operations in the AVM that are core to the AVM that are no longer needed, but that are also very expensive. So I said that this will be a lot of work. And for the rest of this the presentation, I'm going to touch on some of the things that you'll have to think about, and then just touch on a little bit of the technical. I'm not going to go deep into the technical piece because a lot of the challenge here is not technical. A lot of the challenge is really going to be planning and organizing. And then towards the end, we'll talk about some of the things you have to consider when you look at this. The content modeling is going to be different. The user interface uses a different framework, And the deployment tools are slightly different. We had ASRs and FSRs with the AVM. We have, we have the deployment targets that are slightly different. And those, there's just some slight differences there. So one of the things that's different is the content modeling. And back in the AVM system, we had the XSD. So you had an XSD schema. And that allowed you to define both the content model, well, three things, the content model, well, two things, the content model and the look and feel, which honestly is seductively easy in the sense that it allows you to do it all at once. And a lot of the lighter weight web content management tools do that, like Drupal. You define it, you're defining everything. You define the constraints, you define the widget that it uses, you define the content type. And that's easy, I think, for smaller concerns. I think when you start getting to a larger enterprise situation, I think it makes sense to separate the content modeling from the capture, because you might need more than one form. For certain content types, you may want to give one kind of a user a lot of access, and then another user, you might say, okay, we know the department you're in, we know a lot about you, so some of this metadata is going to be boilerplated in. You're not going to touch it. But we'll give you the piece of the form that we want, the pieces that we want you to be able to modify. And so that gives you flexibility in an environment that has a rich set of actors that are working together for this process. One of the other things that's a real problem, the constraint validation in the AVM is done at the UI level. It's not done in the repository, which is a huge problem, because it means that you can't even go and have an automated process push content in without being confident that that content's been validated coming in. But, as I said, it's a low entry threshold, but on the other hand, it's inflexible. So that's the pros and cons of what we're doing now. So there is, but because you have to convert this, there's something you need to think about with this. And so I took an example from one of our training, our training courses, and here's a content model. Now I don't know, it could be a bit of an eye chart. So it has a title, a teaser, a publishing date, whether or not it's a feature article, and the body. Those pieces can map directly into our content model, into the core repository's content model with no problem. Even the constraints, like this says minimum occurrence is 0, which basically says these are optional. You can, for the most part, map the constraints into standard constraints in the core repository. Having said that, there are some ways where you can actually say for an element, you can say there's a minimum occurrence of 3 and a maximum occurrence of 5. That's hard to model. I mean, that doesn't use any of the out-of-the-box constraints, but you could write a constraint to do that. So you could write a range constraint, in terms of range of the number of values if you wanted to. The trickier one is this little beastie here. It's a set of related links. Of course, it does have this constraint which says minimum occurrence of 0, maximum occurrence of 10. So you'll have to contend with the fact that you have to constrain it to that set of, cardinality. The other piece is this is a complex type now. So it has link text and link type. In the Alfresco content modeling scheme, we don't have the ability to have complex, properties. So that poses a challenge. And I've already been talking through this. So I talked about cardinality can be handled. Inter-content relationships can be handled either with node refs, and they could be versioned, or relationships wouldn't get versioned. But complex metadata types could be an issue. There are a couple of ways to handle it. None are perfect. You could bundle the value into a serialized version of a composite property. So you store the composite, serialized version. That's a little skeevy just because you're not going to be able to search. You could have a parallel set of multi-valued properties. That might work a little bit better. I think that you'd probably need to build some constraints around that, and which you could do, but I think that could be accomplished with parallel properties and some constraints managing that. Now, the question that really comes to mind there, though, is what happens if somebody creates an object that violates those constraints? Do you want to throw an exception outright? Do you want to put an aspect on it that says there's a problem? You can use child objects. And so you could have some contentless objects that are just metadata objects, create a relationship that's, you could call it custom : composite property. You could do that. There's still be some search implications there, but that could work. You could alter the data dictionary. I wouldn't go there. I mean, it's a possibility. I mean, there'd be a lot to think about because it has search implications and things like that. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge with some of these migrations from the standpoint of modeling content. That's what you're going to have to think about. The nice thing about moving everything to the core repository is you have a unified modeling scheme for all content. You don't have this one, set of content model that's modeled differently and then another one that's modeled the same. And say what you will about the XML model we have for, our content model. It is what it is. I'd rather have to deal with one than two. And the fact of the matter is, even when you do web's content management in the old AVM, guess what? You still had to create a content model because you needed the aspects for the metadata extraction. Okay? So I think this provides a much more straightforward way of just modeling the content that comes into the repository. The other thing you will have to contend with is moving from the web form XSD to the Forms SDK. Now, I'm going to say this, full disclosure, I have not looked at the SDK. I've done some stuff with Share, and, I don't have to do a whole lot because just like the web form-based, forms, the share-based forms tend to pick out a reasonable default UI, and for the most part, you're okay. We've had to play around with it a little bit, but it was in 3.4, so we didn't even have the Forms SDK for it. Both have out-of-the-box widgets. Both allow for custom widgets. Web Forms use Dojo. Forms SDK uses UI. And developers can also use widgets and UIs built on other frameworks. So you don't have to build your entry form in Share or anything we provide. You can have a completely separate UI. Now, because the repository enforces the data integrity, you now really do have the ability to add something from another UI because you'll get an exception back if you try to put garbage in, and you'll get an exception back if you try to shove garbage in with an automated process. Okay? And developers, can also write, helper web scripts to populate pickers and select lists and things like that. So all of this is available to you if you decide you want to use another framework. There's also changes in deployment. Now, I've played around with both deployments a while back. There's a few things I know. The tools are similar. There are some differences. One of the things that I've been able to do in the past is extend the FSR. I mean, there's callbacks and things you can do. I know with the new ASR, they added some callback features. I don't know how that maps over to the transfer services with that we have now. So if you've done any extensions on the deployment targets, you might have to go back and revisit that code. Okay? There may be a different way of saying, oh, something happens on transfer. It just may be a different way of doing that. So there's a change there. So I had these 3 areas that we talked about, and it's just a way of saying this is a non-trivial migration. Now, how many of y'all have done migrations of any kind before? How many of y'all have done an easy migration? All right. So there's risks and there's reward. There's a definite cost to doing this conversion. But the benefits in performance, clarity of development process, and flexibility are probably worth it. But that's something, as developers, you're going to have to sit down with the business owners and the stakeholders and say, here's what we're dealing with. And, having worked in an enterprise, environment before I was an Alfrescan, those issues of, okay, we're doing this migration, there's a cost associated with it. There's a disruption of services. There's a disruption of people's processes. And end users, non-techies, really don't like disruption of their process. I mean, even when I'm working with something as an end user, even being a techie, you disrupt my process, I can get pretty cranky. So there's at a high level, there's kind of a generic conversion process you want to think about. Just the whole assessment of this thing. What's the vision? What are we trying to do? I mean, we've got to migrate. Are we going to add new functionality? Are we going to take a re-engineering opportunity? There's questions that are asked there. I would also recommend, with as big a change as you're looking at doing here, doing some kind of a POC. I mean, and not just a POC, but something that allows you to kind of delve into the pieces that might be especially challenging, but also allow your development team, who's eventually going to actually do this work, to let them get a view into what it's going to take. Because, a lot of times you say, we're going to do this. Well, wait, try a mini version of it. Try to, stick your big toe in there. Kick the tires a little bit. See what's going on. Because if you know what you're getting into, just having that little bit, when you start to now evaluate the cost, the potential cost, the effort, you'll have much more, you'll have much more information doing it. And once you've done that, you probably can develop a credible plan that'll allow you to execute. I would also look at some of the partner products. I mean, there's opportunities to solve problems and use cases, for many use cases here. We have some partners who are actually already providing solutions, for some of the use cases. I think that, and these bullets are more, geared towards some of the partners, because we have this mass migration that is happening, that will have to happen, or people will be left behind. I think that there's an important aspect to Alfresco and partners coming up and saying, look, how do we make this as easy as possible for the organizations that have to do this? And there's a lot of talk within the organization about how do we make this process a successful process, because we don't take it lightly. Our partners aren't taking it lightly. They're actually looking at ways, because they have customers who are on the hook for migrating. So I think that that's an issue here. What I'd like to do is, going back to this high-level generic process, I want to just talk about some of the things I think you should think about during each of these steps, because it's just because it's such an important step here. So when you're looking at the current use case, I mean, you may have to look at, does the process work? You know, what improvements? So first, you know, you have this process that you have now. Does it work for you? Is it doing what you need to do? You're going to have to make some changes. Do you want to do just to, okay, what we have here, we're just going to implement it over here? Or are you really looking at opportunities to do something different? The other thing that I think is important is, from the start, getting a technical inventory of all the things that you know are going to change and starting to think about strategies for doing them. And you might want to look at these and say, you know, which one of these things look especially challenging? And when you start to go into a proof of concept or, you know, or prototyping, you know, you might brainstorm around and say, okay, let's try these things because we think these things could be blockers if we can't do them. We might need additional information on them. And then, you know, going back to some of the use case thing, look at the usability. What users do you have, and how are they going to be impacted? What did I do here? And then in terms of brainstorming, I mean, you know, just get some of the other stakeholders in the room. Talk about what's going on. Look at different strategies. I mean, people, you know, some of the people in the business side, some of the users might have some alternate ideas. They might look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, we don't like this process. We wish it did this. I mean, you know, so I think getting, you know, not just looking at it as, oh God, we have to migrate, we're going to make everybody's life difficult. Think of it in terms of, you know what can we do, you know, how should this work, and get wide input. And then, you know, you're going to have to think about what tasks are going to be really expensive, figure out if you need them, and then just look at the, you know, the bucket the features into, you know, how important they are, how easy they are, and, you know, and as I said before, look at re-engineering opportunities. Once you decide how you're going to, you know, approach this or how you think you're going to approach this and you need to prototype, you know, get a representative set of items that can be done quickly or that represent go, no-go items to just look at it, and also identify items that allow the team to gain better insight into the process. You know, this is going to be something that's, you know, that you want to be prepared when you get ready to do it. I think once you do these steps, once you look at it and take a hard look at it and say, can we do this? What is it going to take? What's it going to cost? What skills do we need to get involved? Do we need to get a partner? Do we need to get consulting? Or can we do it ourselves? Then I think you're at the point where you can develop a credible plan. You can now go and look and have a plan that says, look, we think it's going to take these resources and we can do it. But I think that my recommendation with something as big as this, that's uncharted waters, is that you don't have a lot of roadmaps for this. So you might need to develop at least a mini roadmap or take a peek over the hill before you actually, you know, go running down the hill. You have the lessons learned, stakeholders, and, you know, just identify what you need. Once you have a credible plan, you can execute. Now, as I said before, plans notwithstanding, it's uncharted waters. Don't be surprised if there are bumps in the road. I've been on migrations before. I was on a migration. It wasn't an AVM migration, but this was a migration. We planned everything. We had everything straight. We were ready to rock and roll. I even set up to be at the customer site on a Saturday. The Friday before, we're like, oh crap, we can't move. I was like, why? Something with one of the routers, the way it was set up in the firewall, just, you know, screwed up, you know, some of the UE code. You know, I mean, so, you know, it was those, so we had to delay it by a month. You know, and so all I'm saying is that in any migration, you will plan, you will do everything. Make sure that as you commit, you leave yourself a little buffer there, because old man Murphy, you know, Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will go wrong, okay? But, and finally, so I think we can draw some conclusions here. You'll get some benefits out of this. It's going to be necessary. You can get some benefits. It's not trivial. It's not trivial. But I think if you prepare yourself, think about it holistically, you'll definitely be able to make it through. Any questions? Okay. I'm the lucky one. Thank you. I haven't worked personally with a customer that's done it. I do know that there are customers we have talked about doing this with, and part of the concern is, what is this going to take to do it? You know, quite honestly, you know, what is it going to take? It's not, it's not an easy sell sometimes to the business, and that's why I say looking at the opportunities for improvement is important, because I think sometimes if you just look at it as this is a cost that, if you look at it as this is a burden we have to bear, you know, as opposed to this is an opportunity we have, I think, you know, it's a very different conversation. Yeah?
Broken the web page, sorry.
I'm sorry?
Hi. We've had a problem on our site before. The content that we've deployed has actually broken the web page. And, you know, it has been, like, there have been a number of pieces of content. We didn't necessarily know what pieces of content were actually breaking the web page in time to fix it. And when we did that, there was a complete revert. We reverted back to an old snapshot. And I'm just wondering how we should change our process for the WCS. So that we, you know, what do we do? Do we revert each file, you know, on its own?
Well, let me ask you a question. Can you tell me the characteristics of the files that were deployed that broke the web page?
They were XML, and they were being parsed by the web server. Okay. And the content within that XML was then rendered on the web page as content.
So, and how did it break the page? Was it
It was basically you had cut and pasted, Word. Yes.
Ah. Okay. Because, and the reason I asked a question like that is because when you say break a web page, to me that says there's some kind of formatting that happened where a div broke something or something like that. Yeah. And to me, that is more of a process issue in terms of, you know, making sure that, I mean, you know, the beauty with content management systems is you can relieve the authors from having to actually worry about formatting. I mean, you know, they basically can pick styles that would come from a style sheet, and so maybe this is a header, this is something that's being emphasized, and it might be different depending on which web property you're going to or whether it's going into, you know, a catalog. But in that sense, you know, it probably makes sense to make the process more of a content management process, and look at how do you, I mean, I don't know. I mean, how do you audit people and keep them from, you know, throwing, you know, messed up Word, you know, XML into I don't know, unless you have something. I know TinyMCE and some of the other WYSIWYG editors have cleaners that can go in and do that. And, you know, maybe that's something you catch and you can have a filter for it. But that's a good question. I mean, that's a interesting one. You know, it seems solvable, but, you know, some of it is also, you know, human engineering.
I was going to say, more to elaborate on that, as Murphy's Law, you can put all the processes you want, but as you said, something can go wrong at some point, and if your site is down, you can review your process next week or the next day, but you've got to fix your site. And without revert functionality, it's quite fundamental that you can't fix it at that moment in time when your site is down. You can't wait for, all right, we should have improved our process, or there's ways around it. Well, so, I mean, is there a way in DM to get around that?
Well, see, here's the thing. I mean, you could when you deploy things, say, keep a running record of what was deployed and what changed. I mean, you can have a change log. One of the concerns that, when I think of and maybe this website is slightly different, a lot of websites that we have, you might have, content going out almost asynchronous to each other, and you might have a situation where something that broke the website maybe didn't break it from a formatting standpoint, but was a piece of content that really didn't need to be out there, got out, and then you had, like, maybe legal looked at it and says, oh no, we got to get that off right away, and then you had other content that went out afterwards. In that case, you really just want to get that one piece of offending content and rip it out, rather than have to roll back and then roll back work that somebody else may have done that was perfectly valid. And I don't know if that's the process you have. How many files were put together, or was it really one offending XML that did this? Yes. Yeah, and it was hard to isolate, probably because you had a bunch of XML pieces on there. You didn't know which one was actually breaking.
Yes, as you said, we have a site that aggregates lots of sources and lots of XML coming from different sources.
Okay.
So if I manage to say the press releases or the news section of our site,
yeah,
there's no way, so it is still separated, but there are times you might want to revert it or see who published it or keep a log of who published it yesterday, who published the last 7 publishes.
Right.
So if something goes wrong, you can find out what went wrong. But it looks like there's no way to, which the AVM gives you.
Well, do you have a previewing thing where basically you push it out to a staging server to look and make sure it was formatted properly?
We do, but someone's got to use it. So if they didn't use it, which they didn't in this case, there's still the fundamental problem we've got to fix as engineers. We still got to fix the site.
I got you. Yeah, I think given what you've told me, you could roll back, but in a case of rolling back, you are now rolling back to something that might pull work that should have been out there anyhow. It sounds like there may be troubleshooting, kinds of things and say, okay, if there's a broken page, how do we detect quickly that, oh, somebody broke it with divs? I mean, you could keep track of all the changes and say, okay, we're going to pull every piece of content that, that was put out, to go back. But that's a tough one, especially if you have multiple sources, pushing it out, because rolling back now becomes pretty draconian.
Yes, but if your site's down,
yeah,
you can
I understand. Yeah, I'm done. One more? Okay.
How do you suggest to migrate content from the old WCM to the new DM repository? So if a customer has a tune of content stored on the WCM repository, in the AVM repository, which is the best way to move that content to the new DM repository?
When you say the best way, you're talking about migrating the content. Well, I think there's 2 pieces to that. One is, how do you first have to change the content model and have a target. I think also you're going to have to contend with whether or not you want to keep the old versions of it. I think that's going to be another piece. Once you figure that out, based on a lot of my experience with just migrations in general, you probably want some method of extraction that pulls the content out in a way that you can maybe use the bulk file system import or some kind of a import tool to pull it back in. I don't think I would recommend doing it in process where you have repository to repository connections, because in the past we've looked at that and that can be very slow because you've got so many database activities going on and waiting for each other. In this other migration we're talking about, it was actually from a non-Alfresco system, but the first iteration, we were actually, we had the bulk file system import tool kind of thing, but we modified it to go against their legacy repository. We found that the performance got killed because of the back and forth to their repository. So what they ended up doing was just dumping their database tables out as images and then rewriting the import tool to just go in and search these files, and so they like sped it up by a factor of 50. So I think having an extract, doing some kind of transformation and then loading it, is probably going to be the best way, just based on some of the things I've seen.
But is Alfresco planning to develop a tool to support these kind of migrations, or it's a?
I know of nothing in the works from a product standpoint. Now, that doesn't mean that something couldn't come from the community, from the field, folks like from consulting or whatever. I mean, it may be, this may be something, or it could come from a partner. I think that the concept is there. Now, the question is, does it make sense for, somebody on the Alfresco side to do it, for a partner to do it? I think that, it's fairly straightforward, but there's a fair amount of work in doing that. So there's nothing that I know that's planned. But I think that's a very good observation in terms of a tool that would be needed, having had this conversation. I think there's one, I'll take one more.
Yeah, thanks. Mine looks like a follow-up to his, but a bit different. From your own experience, what would you suggest? Can one just start building a new system instead of migrating, looking at the challenges?
Well, I think that, so when you say a new system, I still think there's an aspect of migration there, because you have content that's in the old repository. It depends on the content. I mean, if the content is still valid content, I mean, if it's content that you still need to have, available on the web, that's still relevant, I think you have to, pull it in. Now, you might, as part of the process, take the opportunity to retire content that's no longer being used.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that it's perfectly valid to say, you know what, we don't have to keep this from a record standpoint. Let's retire it. I mean, you can, keep the database tables and everything, and keep like an image of it, but you can certainly retire it. But I do think that if for anything that's still valid, it might need to be updated, as active content, you probably need to have it in a repository somewhere.
Okay. Why I'm asking this is that now, looking at the challenges, I'm just looking at from what you've presented, it's good to migrate, but we don't have all the necessary technical skills. And instead of going through that, I'm thinking, why don't we just start a new website portal with this in mind?
How much content do you have?
In terms of bytes, kilobytes?
Or just in terms of number of content items?
Not so much, but for...
Like 10,000, 100, 2,000?
Maybe tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands, okay. Yeah. I mean, how much of that content would you still need to put into the new system?
More than half.
More than half?
Yeah.
Okay. And in your estimation, is it cheaper to have...
So develop all over
again? So you're going to develop, I mean, there's the whole development of the website, but is it going to be cheaper to do the migration process of extracting and importing? Or will it be cheaper to just have a bunch of interns come in and just type it back in?
Well, that's the one I find a bit confusing. That's what I'm asking from your own experience. Mm-hmm. The essence is looking at the cost and time. Mm-hmm. It may take us to get it right in the new environment. That's what I'm just asking. Why don't I just start all over in the new environment, disregarding the old environment? That may be more expensive, but it may save me, because I don't know how long or what are the things that can go wrong in the migration process.
See, I think when you talk about migration, there's two streams to this. There's the development that you have to do on a new system, okay? And I think that's really a new system. I mean, I don't see that as really a migration. You're saying, here's what I have, here's my target. So I think the real issue is the content. And so I go back to if it's cheaper to get a bunch of interns to go in, type it up, and to have somebody validate the content than it is to write kind of a big bang, content transformation process, then by all means do it. But I'm not convinced that, and I think that's something you have to, because it's not just the act of typing it in. Even if they cut and paste, they can make mistakes, and that's the problem. I mean, with a program, if the program makes a mistake, you tweak the program and you rerun it, because the program is going to make the same mistake over and over and over again. A human being is going to make one mistake here, another mistake there. They might not follow the process, and so that's the consideration that I would look at. I mean, if you said you had like, less than 1,000 pieces of content, I'd probably say, yeah, maybe that does make sense to have somebody retype it in, But maybe, if you have accurate typers who could do it in a week, it might, All right? Thanks, everybody.